Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card, the show for people who want to think deeply about the books they read and get inspired to read more. I'm Megan Gliona. I'm here with Brian Brinkman and RJB. Today, we're doing something new again. We've talked novels, we've talked movies, we've gone deep in a short story collection, but today we're going to do something that we've never done, and we're going to do it a few more times this year. We're going to be comparing and contrasting two short stories. I'm really looking forward to this. Today, we're going to be talking about Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway and Good People by David Foster Wallace. So, Hemingway, as we all know, is the master of minimalist tradition, and Wallace being the master of maximalist tradition. It's going to be really fun to rub these two stories up against each other. I'm going to start by sharing brief summaries of each, and then we're going to get into our discussion. So, Hills Like White Elephants is a short story by Hemingway. It was first published in August 1927 in the literary magazine Transition. Then later that year, it was also published in the short story collection Men Without Women. In 2002, the story was adapted into a 38-minute short film. This is the story of an American man and woman at a train station in Spain. They're having an opaque conversation about an operation that the man wants the woman to have. She seems undecided and wants to drink beer while waiting for the train. They discuss the possibility of not having the operation, and he moves their bags to the other side of the tracks. The story ends with the man having a drink alone at the bar and then returning to the woman who tells him that nothing is wrong with her. She is fine. Good People by David Foster Wallace was published in The New Yorker on January 28, 2007, and is about a young man and a woman who meet at campus ministries in a junior college as they struggle to make a decision whether or not the woman should have a procedure. It is clearly inspired by the Hemingway short story, but unlike the Hemingway version, this one takes place inside the interiority of the young man as he struggles with his faith, his morality, and his lack of love for the young woman. Although never mentioned, both stories are assumed to be about abortion. So I think it's so interesting that you have a writer like Wallace, who I have not read a lot of, to be honest, but I know of him and know what he's known for. And thinking about him and Brian, I'm excited to hear your thoughts about this later because I know that you're a big fan of David Foster Wallace. But thinking about him using this kind of genre of this minimalist tradition and really subverting it and using it as a framework to dive into interiority. So I thought that was an interesting place to start today to think about how these stories are the same and how they're different. RJ, I thought maybe you could start us off because you chose these stories for us and you paired them together. So I'd love to hear kind of why you chose them together and also what you think maybe the biggest similarities of the stories.
Yeah, and differences or just similarities?
You can go into both. I'm down for
Well,
that.
because I think the similarities the similarities I guess in terms of topic area are like easy. In terms of like
Yeah.
the differences, that's where the biggest contrast is. And I think that was
Mhm.
probably purposeful, right? Because
Yeah.
Foster Wallace clearly like knew he was clearly writing it like in tribute to or in response to or inspired by or whatever the other story. But to me, like for Hills Like White Elephants, like first of all, writing a whole story, even though it's short, in almost all dialogue is pretty hard. That's just a hard like thing to do
Yeah.
writing wise. It's a hard structure to you need. That's the whole reason that there's like exposition in between dialogue because it's just really hard to tell a whole story with dialogue, which
Yeah.
Hemingway
It's like a
does.
play.
And then yeah, and then the Foster Wallace story is almost no dialogue. So I think like structurally, it's interesting that you can have the same topic area, the same kind of struggle that people are going through about this particular topic with like the actual exact opposite, you know, approach. And so I thought that was like to me the biggest difference. I mean, I guess like for me, like I don't know if David Foster Wallace did this intentionally, but the other kind of bigger thing is like Hills Like White Elephants and maybe a lot of Hemingway stuff is it's just so much about like power dynamics between men and women, you know?
Mhm.
Whereas Good People like really does make it seem like he's trying to the Lane is trying to do like the right thing. It's like a much like softer view of like what a
Mhm.
man might go through in a situation like this as opposed to the other story, which is like much more like the guy's just kind of a dick, and that's like kind of how a lot of the Hemingway characters are and probably how he was. But so like those dynamics, in terms of like the structure of the writing is so different, and then just how it portrays like masculinity, I think is really interesting. And I wonder if Foster Wallace was responding to that overly kind of, I guess typical portrayal of masculinity in the way that he shows the interiority of the character.
Yeah, I mean, I took a lot away from it that you're describing. I think what it speaks to from a masculinity standpoint, I mean, you're 80 years apart essentially in releasing these stories. Think about how much has evolved and changed in terms of how men perceive themselves and how men perceive themselves next to women and within relationships. Um, this is not to say everything has changed and not for the better in that sort of way. That's not the argument I'm making, but more like the way this couple is, or these two people are processing this in 1927 in Hills Like White Elephants is very much of a control situation that this unnamed thing, but we all know what he's talking about. Um, this will mess up my life and what I'm going after and what I'm trying to do. And so, because this relationship is, I think you're intended to understand, doesn't matter as much to this man, may matter more to this woman. Um, the decision is essentially being made, but I'm not going to force you to make it. I'm just going to tell you why you should make it. Whereas you fast forward then to, and I think the name of the story, Good People, really hints to this idea of, can we both still be good people even after doing this, even after this happening and it leading to where we're at right now. He is so concerned with her perception and every little glance towards him and away from him. And he wants to make sure that he's making the decision with her in mind, but also recognizing that if he makes a completely opposite decision, pulls out of this, is that him being more honest and doing right by her. And there's just so much more self-consciousness in it.
Mm,
Whereas like Hemingway is essentially like, this is the way it is because this is the way it is, and so this is the way it will be. And that simplicity and that focus that you got out of his writing has been abandoned by the time we get to the early 20th century, and someone like David Foster Wallace is showcasing how in a lot of cases men are, I want to be very careful about what I say here, but are overthinking these types of things. You know what I mean? Like there's
mhm.
constant analysis of what your actions, how they can be perceived.
Yeah, I agree with all of what you're saying. I think it's really interesting thinking about the structure of the story because I agree with what you're saying, RJ, about this idea that like one is using dialogue and one is using internal conflict. But I do think the structure of how the story was written is the same in that it's got two people in a very specific place, the setting being very evocative and having so much symbolism. I think the symbolism in both stories is really parallel. In you've got hills like white elephants, and in this story, he's really using the train station as a place that people are coming and going, that people are, you know, ending something or beginning something. It's kind of a transitionary place. And then in Good People, that's really interesting to me because he describes the setting in some really interesting ways too, where he's talking about, um, they're at this lake and there's a tree that's been upturned. There's just been some sort of like big storm, and that's kind of symbolizing what's happened in their relationship. And there's this upturned tree, which can represent the woman in the story. And then there's this man that he keeps describing that's not part of the conversation, but standing alone, which I think really stands in for Lane's kind of how he's feeling so alone in this, even though he's with this woman. And I think that really stood out to me that to me, it's just such a genius move to have a writer read a master writer and who writes so differently from him, but use a way to his writing as a way to kind of dive into something in a really different way, which I thought was really cool. But I think the use of symbolism, the use of the structure to me was very similar. And I agree. I think that like there was this duality about what you're saying, Brian, about how much has changed in 80 years, but also how much has stayed the same in the sense that men and women are still having the exact same conversations in some way and the same questions. And what's so interesting to me about Wallace's take on it is that it's a dive into morality, and Hemingway never really does that. You know, he allows you to decide how you feel about the characters, and it's really just he's so action based. I just finished The Sun Also Rises, and was it's so interesting to read a book that's basically about a group of man and a woman and their dynamics within that group, and have it feel so emotionally removed when all of them are going through huge emotions throughout the book, because he really allows you to fill in the blanks in a way that I think is trusting of his reader and also really interesting. And it's so different from how I read often that it really like pushed me. It was really challenging for me, and I really liked it. But I think here reading Wallace and seeing how he dives so deep into the morality of it, to me, was just really, I loved that. I thought it was something that was really interesting. I think this idea of when you make a decision that is outside of your assumed morality, in this case, it's his faith, this character, Lane's faith. He has this deep faith, and religion is obviously a big theme in Good People. That, how does that define you? And the difficulty of aligning actions with beliefs. There's a line in Good People. He says that it's at the moment when Lane has this kind of realization that maybe he's not a bad person despite the situation that he's in or whatever choices they make. And he says he realizes that he was not a hypocrite, just broken and split off like all men. And I thought that was so beautiful and so true, because I think there's a real attempt to dig into how hard it is to be human in this story, in Good People, in a way that Hemingway doesn't kind of dig into.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that like whenever you read a Hemingway, you kind of walk away feeling pretty blown away that with how minimalistic was. I'd be curious if it's different for you, but like for me, you can see and smell and feel everything in the story. He somehow just like conjures up these images without telling you. But as a result of it, he doesn't necessarily dive into the morality or kind of what is happening within someone's head as they're like weighing all of these options. And because of the way David Foster Wallace writes, where everything within the picture and then within the person and then within the picture is applicable to be written about and
Yeah.
like there are certain essays of his that are literally just like almost checklists of setting and characters just so that like you know the full picture of what's happening here. um but I mean, I think to your point, like because of that he does get to the root of, I think, debates around young men's role in society over the last like 25, 30 years in a really fascinating way that like Hemingway would never have approached. And so leads to some flaws, I think, moralistically in like some of Hemingway's writings. Whereas in David Foster Wallace, he's at least exploring it, at least bringing this up as, you know, a question to toss around and, you know, be a part of your relationship with the story.
What were some themes that stood out to you in either story? Brian, why don't you,
I
RJ,
mean,
you want to go?
no, go ahead, Brian.
I mean, I think the biggest one is, you know, from a like, what do your actions actually mean? And like, do they actually, like, is there a direct relationship with your actions and ultimately being a good person? And like, like, like the decision that Lane's trying to make in Good People versus what the main character in Hills White Elephants are trying to communicate. They're both, it feels like trying to get out of a situation without saying directly what they want to say.
Yeah.
And so they've already done something, but like taking another action, like what that ultimately will do to another person and will do to themselves, like that kind of that theme of like our actions, what do they actually say about who we are versus what we tell other people, what we want ourselves to believe. Just hit me hard when I was thinking about both of these.
Is that something that resonated with you, RJ?
Yeah, and I think like like you talked about the setting. I mean, I think the like isolated man standing on the other side of the lake thing was interesting. I mean, I feel like both of these stories used metaphor like in a very direct way. Like there's no real like real mystery about it. Like white elephant is like it's like a thing that's useless kind of is like the idea, right? So it's like hills being like a pregnant person, white
Yeah.
elephants, it's like it's very direct, and I feel like the man and the kind of dude who's just standing there is like the unsaid thing, you know.
Mm,
So I
Yeah.
feel like in
Yeah.
interesting.
both cases
The
it's like
third kind of. Mhm.
they're kind of both like focused on this like thing that's there that no one's talking about, which is just it's just interesting because I feel like in a lot of these short stories like the metaphor is very it's like harder to tease out, but here it's just like it's very straightforward and direct, which is interesting, and I wonder if Foster Wallace was kind of doing that on purpose as a way of kind of drawing similarity between that and the original story.
Yeah, it's impressive to do that and have it work well. I
Yeah.
think to be really obvious about your metaphors and to have them still hit is, only a master writer can really do that, and I think they both do in a way that's really, really cool. I think Hemingway has that too with the bags, how they have all these stickers on them of where they've been, and that kind of is the baggage that they bring into this relationship and how they're on the same side of them, and then he moves them over, and the man's moving them over, and he's putting the bags to go the other direction, and then he spends time on his own, and then he comes back to her, and then she's immediately like, "I'm fine, everything's fine." And I think there's so much metaphor in both of these stories in a way that really works. It's really powerful. It's pretty
Yeah.
incredible how evocative these stories are despite being so short. I mean, I think the David Foster Wallace piece especially gets into so many themes that, we've talked about the morality idea, but also faith versus individual desires. When you
Hmm.
think you have these beliefs, but then, you have like these human desires that go against that, and what that can feel like inside. I think the idea of good versus bad not always being easily defined. I think that's something that's fascinating to me, and I think he gets into that in a way that I really liked. I think putting this inside a religious context is really powerful, and especially the age of these kids. I think that's a time when a lot of people, I think, are interested in religion and interested in what it can or cannot give to them, and it's kind of interesting to see this young man's faith being, like, eroded in real time in a way. It's pretty cool.
So there's something interesting about like the setting being like a place of transition almost, and these characters being kind of stuck there. And so like this idea that like life is going on around them, and because of the decision that they have to make right now, there's like a permanence to where they're at this point in time.
Mm,
Um, and you just really get a sense, especially in the Foster Wallace one, because the Hemingway one I love reading the dude, but there's like when I try to put myself into his stories, there's like no real relation whatsoever
yeah.
of them. But with Foster Wallace, like there's like I feel a part of a lot of his characters. Um, and I don't know if that's just being born when I was born or whatever, but like there's a real sense that these characters know one way or the other, this is going to be one of the most impactful aspects of their lives. And it's either going to be something that they carry with them, or it's going to be something that ultimately shifts how their life works going forward. And you really feel this sense of like they're in a place that you're supposed to kind of be walking through, soaking in the beauty, enjoying a break from reality. And instead, like all of that has come to you.
Yeah, there's a real kind of, time has stopped around them feeling to both of those situations that I think is really beautiful and amazing. I think this idea of communication too, they both stories really talk or hint at this theme of communication between men and women, and I think especially in the Foster Wallace piece, you realize, like, he feels so alone and alienated even though he is right next to this woman and he's kind of experiencing this with her. Whereas and I think both of the characters in the Hemingway story seem very alone as well too, just pretty sad.
Yeah.
That goes
Yeah,
for
I
a
think
lot
that
of Hemingway characters, it feels like.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's cool how Foster Wallace uses like nature descriptions of nature to kind of like, you know,
I
reinforce
know
all
he's
the
so good at that.
both the themes you guys were talking about. It's really interesting. Um, there's one part in that story where it's like sort of the first time that he mentions like his faith, and I feel like it's a short story, obviously, but that's where like the story kind of changes. Like a page and a half into it, where it's like now it's kind of about his internal battle about faith, not necessarily about it, like kind of changes there from being about like his conversation with her and all the weirdness to like now he's talking about his faith. And I don't know, it's interesting how it can change really quickly and still feel like contiguous with the rest of the story.
Yeah, his that character Lane is like such a and this sounds kind of a stupid word to describe this. It's such a nimble thinker. He's moving so quickly through ideas, and it's it really reminds you of that time when you're that age and realizing when you're the first time you're facing a really important decision and you realize like how little you know. And I think that really hits so deeply and is really beautiful. I really love the ending of the Foster Wallace piece. I wanted to talk to you guys about that because it's it sort of feels like it's interesting because he goes through this experience of imagining what she's going to do, but that's not like she doesn't actually do it yet, but he imagines that she's going to say this to him that I've made the decision and don't worry about it and give him a chance to be like this stand-up guy and he's going to decide what to do in that moment, but then he kind of questions everything he feels about because he's very sure in the beginning of the story that he doesn't love her. And then by the end, he's kind of wondering, do I even know what love is? So what did the end feel like to you guys?
Well, I think he just does an incredibly accurate job of sitting inside of the head of someone who has a life decision to make and their thoughts are racing too quickly. Like, I think
Yeah.
we've all probably felt that at some point where you're just like, you can't really think straight because like so many alternatives and what ifs are coming through your head. And I think he's also there's like you can kind of step back and see that if you are going to think this much and this empathetically about another person, like that is almost like an act of love in a
Mhm.
way. And like he's almost coming into the realization that he could do this. He could be with this person for, this reason. But there's just like there's so much coming at his head in this very quiet, contemplative place that I don't even I almost got the sense as the story was concluding that like he doesn't even have a full grasp on exactly where he's at. Like when the story ends as we read it, his thoughts are just going to continue going in a completely different like there's just too much happening right now for him.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy how like it kind of goes from him trying to figure out what she's thinking and what she is like what she'll do, like what you guys said, and then to like it switches from that to like now what's he supposed to do and how does that all coexist with his faith and all that. I mean, it's crazy. It's like a really wild adventure. Although I assume that this is like kind of indicative of his writing in general.
Yes.
It feels like a like the character is like a depressed manic person going through like something crazy.
Yeah, and I mean by the time that this is published, it's about a year and a half before he would die, and, the way that he starts to feel like he's writing The Pale King at this point in time, but the way that, like, the world kind of catches up with him and these big decisions that he has to make and where he's at with his career and what does that mean long term and what's happening in larger society, all kinda catches up with him about 18 months later, but yeah, you can tell this is definitely written from the mind of someone who, um there's no simple decision. Let's put it
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that, where there's no, like, quick, "Okay, I need to do this," and, like, one foot in front of the other for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, his seems almost like his character, and maybe this is similar to him in real life too, but it's just, plagued with a mind that thinks so deeply about things that it's hard to make decisions possibly.
Yeah.
Very much
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
the way he describes the woman, the young woman, is so beautiful because I love how he paints this picture of her and you know who she is with there's probably like, I don't know, 10 sentences about her specifically in there, but you can picture her so clearly and the way he describes her body moving, and I just found it to be really interesting. It made me wanna read more of him, to be honest.
He's
Yeah. I thought it was,
amazing.
yeah. I mean, it's like, it's an undertaking. Even like this story, which is short, it's hard, you know? You gotta be in it deep.
It's full focus.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I find Hemingway harder to read than him because
Hmm.
Really.
yeah, because there's a few reasons why it's harder for me, I think, and one might just be a gender bias, honestly. I find it really hard to decide where the emotional in is in Hemingway and,
Mm,
also
mm,
to place myself okay, so the sun also rises. You know, it's a large part about this one man and his relationship with this other woman and then these other men. And the woman in this has multiple relationships with different men in the book, and there's deep feelings clearly between the main character and her, but they're never really clearly displayed except in a few actions in the end. And to me, I just kept wondering like where is my emotional connection to this story. I built my own in a way, but I had to build my own, and I think that's kind of the work that he does. Whereas this story, someone was building that for me, and I could just read it and experience that story as a fully kind of fleshed out interiority where I'm like, oh, I get to spend time in this man's mind, and I can relate to this man and feel for this man and empathize for this man and whereas Hemingway, it's just a different it's so different. I don't know, it's weird. I think being a woman, it's different for me reading Hemingway, and I don't know if that's just an inappropriate thing to say, but it is.
Well, you can feel however you want to feel, you know?
It's
But
true. Thanks.
so
Thanks,
I think
RJ.
that, but I also think like it's not very, that's not a sympathetic protagonist if he is the protagonist,
right.
Yes,
you know?
yeah. Yeah.
I do think it's an accurate read though that like it's hard to find the emotional in. I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
is
Really? Okay.
strangely one of my appeals when I read Hemingway is that like
Mm,
the feel factor is not really expected here. It's not as though I feel nothing for the characters that I read about, but it's more when I read Hemingway, there's like a pace to the way the world moves, and there's a good and evil to the way that the world moves, and a way to explore the nuanced gray in the middle that feels more rational and feels
mm.
less like my feelings will take me one way or the other, which is very much of David Foster Wallace, is like he's writing about all the facts on the ground and then also saying, by the way, I have an irrational aspect of my personality that feels this way about this. And now we're going to explore that along with it. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't like my favorite Hemingway almost read in a lot of cases like nonfiction, um, where
That's
he is
interesting.
which is as I say that, it's funny because my favorite David Foster Wallace is actually his nonfiction. His nonfiction
Hmm.
essays are where I go. So I think both of them have like a very clear eye of the world, but they both explore them from a persona that could only really exist at that time. Like Hemingway
Yeah.
could not be putting out stories in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Like he is very much of a pre and post World War II era writer, whereas David Foster Wallace like only can exist in a postmodern setting.
Yeah. I also think like Hemingway's, the emotion that's tied into these stories almost always is like, not always, but often is like, on the verge of being addressed or processed, and then it's like, now let's like get another beer.
Have some drinks. Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
that's like
Yes.
the
Yeah.
way that you deal with everything, which is also an interesting thing, but I think it doesn't, you know, the interiority is sort of like not there.
Yeah, it's so
100%.
interesting. It's so interesting how that is, and why he wrote like that. I don't know. I find him very interesting, and I'm really excited to read more Hemingway so I can learn more about it and understand it more. But yeah, that's interesting that a listener is saying that Hunter S. Thompson used to transpose Hemingway's books before he started writing. Joan Didion also did that as well, which is interesting. She's one of my favorite writers. So yeah, I think there's a real
He's all form in that sense. Like you're
yeah, he's
basically like it's
yeah,
writing
structure.
practice.
Exactly. And it's like this idea of writing really economically too. And I think that some of my favorite books that I've read over the past few years have been really economical. And I have a few that I want to share with you. But I do think that he's incredible at that, and it obviously has influenced so many people and been truly important. But before we get into recommendations, is there anything else either of you want to say about these stories before we move on?
I loved how these stories essentially just lived in a very similar place and did two completely different things. Just awesome.
It's so cool.
Yeah, I want to like
What were
read a
you saying,
third
RJ?
one. I just want to read like a third story on this with this same, topic and dynamic, but from like a modern writer, a modern female writer,
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I
I
have a
mean,
recommendation based on that.
okay. Okay. Well, I was
But
wondering if what you
yeah,
guys would think what about Taffy Brodesser Ackner writing a
I don't want to
story?
read that. I don't want to read that.
Brian and I would read it.
I'll read it.
I bet
I
it would
would
be
read
funny.
it. I don't know. This isn't
I'm
very funny. I don't know. Maybe that's
I'm
me.
100 pages into Intermezzo right now, and I would 100% read Sally Rooney write about this. The way that she
Oh
gets
yeah.
Good point.
into
Yeah.
characters' heads, very Foster Wallace esque, while also having the ability to kind of like suspend the emotional weight while still giving you much of the emotional weight, kind of like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hemingway does. I mean, she's much more Foster Wallace in that sort of sense, but like I would love to hear what she has to say.
I would
Yeah. Good call.
definitely read that. That's a great call. Yeah. I think she'd do an amazing job of that. She's also incredible at setting too and metaphor. So that would be cool. Um, yeah, I was thinking about books that this reminded me of or that I would want to read about kind of in this idea. And I'm never going to pass up an opportunity to talk about Annie Ernaux, the French memoirist, and also just she writes nonfiction and she writes about her own life. And she's a Nobel Prize winner. She wrote a book called A Girl's Story, and it is the story of when she's young and she has an abortion. And she's incredibly economical. Unfortunately, I can't read her in French because I can't read French anymore, but I would love to read her in French, but her English translations are amazing, and she is very much in the same vein of Hemingway in a weird way in that she's very factual and matter of fact despite discussing, like, deeply emotional things, and I think that for a woman to understand a woman's perspective of these things, but not in a way that might make you feel, overly sentimental or overly emotional. She's very dry in some ways, and she has a really interesting perspective on life. And her choices are, I think, incredibly modern, despite when these stories are taking place. So I would recommend A Girl's Story by Annie Ernaux. And the other story I'd recommend that is modern economical writing is Audition by Katie Kitamura. Totally different, but RJ, you just read this, but just she's so economical and she uses dialogue to tell a lot of her story in a way that I think is similar to Hemingway in that way. And she really allows you to figure out what's going on. That book is super trippy because it basically has two distinct parts that are kind of opposing, in a sense, opposing options for the way the story could go. And I think that book is fascinating and is opaque in the way that these two stories are, in a way that I think is really cool. And the other
Yeah.
economical writing is
Good one.
just Murakami. I think he writes in a really economical way, and Steinbeck, but I think I think Steinbeck was definitely influenced by Hemingway, right? Isn't that true?
Yeah, I mean similar times, but
Yeah.
and definitely more, I think, even-handed towards females, whereas Hemingway
Definitely.
was
I would
kind of
agree.
like, I'm in charge, lady, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Definitely. For sure. Brian, did you
Uh,
have, books that or stories that were this reminded you of, or
well, actually, I took this in a different direction. I want to recommend two pieces by both author or one piece by both authors, just in case there are people out there who haven't read them. The short book by Hemingway, To Have and Have Not, is one of my favorite Hemingway stories ever from his Key West period. Similarly looks at the endless ennui of men in relationships, um, while a woman is kind of just a part of the relationship, and his dedication to the sea and to fishing and to exploring the Caribbean is the key to this man's life, but he has to have someone back home, even in the face of, eventual tragedy. And then the David Foster Wallace piece, I've probably talked about it with you guys multiple times. Up Simba is his nonfiction essay. He was on the McCain bus between New Hampshire and South Carolina in 2000. And what I was saying earlier in terms of his ability to just like basically like go through a checklist of everything that is in his vision, and he's hearing and he's smelling and he's tasting, and what that all does to tell the story of the profile he's essentially writing. It's the best political piece I've ever read in my entire life. It completely shapes the way I view modern American politics, and also just really makes you want to be on a campaign bus that is winning rather than losing, even though it starts to explore what happens when loss creeps into a campaign and doubt creeps into a campaign, and asks this really fascinating question of, can a good person still become president in the United States? Which I think goes hand in hand with a lot of the questions that were asked in the story.
very cool. I've never read that. I need to read that.
It's amazing.
Yeah, those are good ones. I don't have anything else to add. Surprisingly, you guys did it.
You added a
Perfect.
lot. You added a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Well, we're gonna do this again in our next episode.
Yeah.
We're gonna be looking at The Killers by Ernest Hemingway and A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. I'm very excited. I've never read any Flannery O'Connor, so I'm really excited to
Same.
dig into these two stories, and we're gonna read those and talk about them. Are we doing that next week?
Doing that next week. And then we've got a question from one of our listeners. Let me know the next book you guys are going to read in early
Brian, what's up
August.
next?
Early August, we will be talking about Crossroads by Jonathan Franzen, a book we were going to talk about in early July, but we all had so many hot takes about The Blind Assassin that had to supersede it. So Crossroads, and then Intermezzo is coming up in early September. So if you guys want to follow along with us, you've got some time to catch up,
Yeah, you do,
especially
because
if you
we're
read
gonna
at these guys' pace.
yeah, you have some time to catch up. I reread Crossroads for the show, and my God, it holds up. So I would definitely jump on that one if you haven't read that, or if you want to revisit it before our episode. All right, I think we did it, guys. We'll see everyone back next week, and until then, happy reading.